Louis was never the kind of man who complained. For most of his life, he worked with his hands, fixing engines, lifting heavy parts, coming home with grease under his fingernails and a quiet pride in his heart. After retiring at 65, he finally had time to rest, tend to his tomato plants, and take long walks with his dog, Buddy. But over the past few months, something began to shift. It was small at first, just a bit more tired than usual, a strange taste in his mouth that wouldn't go away, and an itch on his arms that felt deeper than the skin. He brushed it off, of course. That's what people like Louis do. Probably just getting older, he'd tell himself. But the fatigue grew heavier. Some mornings, he'd wake up more exhausted than when he went to bed. His ankles started swelling, his face looked puffier, and the night trips to the bathroom became more frequent. Then one day, his wife, Marion, noticed something in his eyes. Not just the yellowish tint, but a kind of quiet worry he didn't want to say out loud. That was the day they decided to see a doctor. I still remember the moment Louis sat across from me in the office. He looked strong, a man who had worked hard all his life, but his voice carried a trace of fear. After some tests, we saw the numbers. His kidneys were struggling and had been for some time. He hadn't felt any pain. That's the tricky part. Kidney disease doesn't always shout. Often it whispers through skin, breath, fatigue, and foggy thoughts. Louis had been missing the signs, not because he didn't care, but because they didn't look serious enough. We talked gently. I explained what was happening, but I didn't overwhelm him with terms or charts. He didn't need a lecture. He needed hope. And the truth is, there was still time. So we took a breath, sat together, and began to map out a few changes. Nothing extreme, just small, meaningful steps. Louis swapped some of his salty snacks for fresh fruit, cut down on the canned soups he used to love, and started drinking more water. Not too much, just enough. He walked a bit more, rested when he needed, and slowly began to feel more himself. But more than anything, Louis began to listen, not just to me or Marion, but to his own body. He started noticing how he felt after eating certain foods. He paid attention to his energy levels, his breath, his skin. He began asking questions, not out of fear, but out of care. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was in control again, and that made all the difference. So tonight, I want to talk to you the same way I talked to Louis. Not to scare you, but to help you notice what your body might be trying to say. You don't need to change everything overnight, but if even one of these signs sounds familiar, take a moment, because the sooner we listen, the more we can do. And you deserve to feel better, to know more, and to stay in control of your health, just like Louis did. Let's begin. Louis had always been a morning man. For nearly 4 decades, his alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., and before the sun even kissed the fields of rural Ohio, he was already in his workshop. Retirement didn't change much. He still woke early, still drank his coffee from the same chipped mug, still sat on the porch with Buddy curled at his feet, but something had shifted. Rest didn't feel like rest anymore. At first, Louis thought it was the weather, the way the cold stuck to his joints in winter, or how the summer heat seemed heavier than before. But then, even after 8 or 9 hours of sleep, he woke up with the same fog behind his eyes. There was a dull weight in his body, like his limbs were dragging through water. His wife, Marion, began noticing it too. How he napped more in the afternoons, how he sometimes sat down halfway through weeding the garden. "You tired, Lou?" she'd ask softly, her voice half joking, half worried. Louis would smile, shrug it off, but inside he wasn't so sure. It wasn't the kind of tired that passed. It was a bone-deep exhaustion, like something in him was quietly dimming. One evening, after forgetting where he'd parked the truck at the grocery store, he stood there in the lot with his hands on his hips, breathing hard and realizing he felt winded from walking. That wasn't normal. He hadn't done anything strenuous, hadn't climbed stairs or carried weight, just walked. That night he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Marion already asleep beside him, the sound of Buddy snoring faintly from the floor. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He remembered what his brother had gone through years ago, the sudden hospital visit, the words kidney failure, the machine, the tubes. Could that be what was happening? Louis didn't feel sick exactly, just fading, slowly, quietly. It took him another 2 weeks to say anything, and when he did, it came out simple. Like most things Louis said, "I don't feel like myself." Marion looked at him with the kind of pause that comes after a lifetime together. "Then we'll figure out what's going on," she said, taking his hand. "You're not meant to fade, Louis. You're still here." The doctor's visit wasn't dramatic, no sirens, no emergencies, just a quiet room, a kind physician, and a few vials of blood. When the results came in, the doctor leaned forward gently, his voice steady. "Louis, your kidneys aren't filtering as they should. It's early, not failure, but it's something we have to take seriously." Louis just nodded. In his mind, he kept thinking, "But I'm not sick, I'm just tired." That's the thing with kidneys. They rarely shout, they whisper. Through fatigue, through subtle changes in breath, through days that feel just a little heavier than they should. What Louis didn't know then was that his kidneys were producing less of a hormone called erythropoietin, something that tells the body to make red blood cells. Fewer red blood cells meant less oxygen, and less oxygen meant that tired, dragging feeling that made rest feel useless. But now that he knew, he could begin to do, not everything, not overnight, but something. And that's where the shift began, not in a medicine or a miracle, but in awareness, in no longer calling it just age or just being tired. He began drinking more water, not too much, just enough to stay gently hydrated. He started writing things down more often, not because he was losing his mind, but because he was learning to respect his brain's signals. He paused more, breathed deeper, and noticed what his body was trying to say. And perhaps most importantly, Louis started talking. With Marion, with his son, even with his neighbor Earl, who always joked about old man problems. No more brushing it off, no more pretending, because fatigue, for Louis, wasn't weakness, it was a signal, and now he was listening. It was a Tuesday evening when Louis first mentioned it, over a simple dinner of grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. He took one bite and paused, chewing slowly, then set his fork down. "Tastes like metal," he said quietly, not looking up. Marion glanced at him. "The chicken?" she asked, half laughing. "I didn't change the recipe." Louis smiled a little, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, it's not the food," he murmured. "It's everything. Lately, it all tastes off, like I'm chewing on an old coin." He picked at the green beans, but didn't finish his plate. That alone was strange. Louis, who could clear a plate like a man still working 10-hour shifts, now leaving food untouched. Over the next few days, he noticed the taste lingered. Morning coffee, metallic, toast and jam, still off. Even the toothpaste seemed bitter. It wasn't just the food, it was his mouth. And with that taste came something worse. No appetite. Things he used to love, bacon, summer peaches, Marion's beef stew, now made him queasy before the first bite. He lost 7 pounds without even trying, and it wasn't the good kind of weight loss. When he returned to the doctor for a follow-up, he brought it up, a little sheepishly. "Everything tastes wrong, Doc," he said, "and I can't eat much without feeling sick." The doctor nodded slowly, not surprised. "That metallic taste, Louis, it's from a buildup of waste in your blood, something called uremia. Your kidneys aren't filtering it out properly. That's why your body's reacting this way." Louis didn't say much in the moment, but on the drive home, he felt a quiet ache settle in his chest. It wasn't just about eating, it was about feeling normal. Meals were part of who he was. He and Marion always cooked together. Saturday mornings used to mean pancakes and sausage. Now he barely wanted toast. That evening, Marion sat beside him with a cup of chamomile tea, her fingers brushing his knee gently. "Maybe we try something new," she said softly. "Lighter meals, more fresh things, just until your body feels better." He nodded, grateful, but still heavy-hearted. The next morning, they walked through the farmer's market together. They picked out apples and cucumbers, ginger and lemon. Marion blended a smoothie with kale, green apple, and mint. Something refreshing, something alive. Louis took a sip, and while the metallic taste still lingered faintly, it wasn't as strong. It reminded him that things could shift slowly. He began eating smaller meals more often, things that were cold and crisp. He found that lemon water helped clear the taste from his mouth, at least for a little while. And though the appetite didn't come back all at once, it flickered like a small flame in a quiet room. More than that, Louis began understanding that this wasn't just about food. It was about toxins, the waste his kidneys could no longer filter. His body was carrying more than it should, and now it was asking for help. That realization changed the way he looked at everything he ate. It wasn't about guilt or strict rules, it was about kindness, about choosing things that helped his body carry less of a burden. So he added more greens, drank more water, ate slowly. He even tried new things, like roasted beets, which he used to hate, but now found oddly grounding. Every small shift felt like an act of care, not punishment, not diet culture, just listening. And Marion, patient as ever, sat with him at each meal. No pressure, no sighs, just company. The kitchen became a quieter place, but also a more intentional one. Louis wasn't eating just to fill up anymore, he was eating to heal. Louis had worn the same pair of brown work boots for nearly a decade. Scuffed, sturdy, reliable, they were as much a part of him as the old truck parked in his driveway. But one morning, while getting ready for his usual walk with Buddy, he noticed something strange. The boots were tight, not just snug, but pressing uncomfortably around his ankles. He unlaced them and tried again, still tight. The next day, even his walking shoes felt wrong. He didn't think much of it at first. "Maybe my feet are just getting wider," he muttered. But by the end of the week, his socks left deep lines around his calves. His ankles looked puffier, and when he pressed his thumb into his shin, the dent stayed for a few seconds before fading. Marion noticed it too, especially when his wedding ring began to feel tight and his eyelids looked a little swollen in the morning light. "You're retaining fluid," she said one night, gently, brushing her hand across his cheek. "Maybe we should check your blood pressure again." Louis didn't answer right away. He felt something heavier than swelling rising in his chest, that quiet anxiety that comes not from a sharp pain, but from the slow realization that something inside is no longer keeping up. At his next appointment, the doctor nodded as Louis pulled up his pant leg to show the swelling. "This is your kidneys talking again," he explained. "When they're not filtering fluid properly, it builds up. Legs, feet, sometimes even your face." Louis sat back in the chair, the word fluid echoing through his head like a leaky faucet. This wasn't something he could walk off. The doctor went on, explaining how healthy kidneys balance the body's fluid and salt levels. When that balance falters, the heart and lungs feel it too. Louis listened quietly. He wasn't afraid of the science. He just didn't want this to be his story. But it was, and the swelling was a reminder he couldn't ignore. Back home, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his feet, now resting in a shallow basin of warm water with a sprinkle of Epsom salt. Marion brought him a towel and said softly, "Maybe it's time to slow down, Lou, just a little." He nodded. "I always thought slowing down would feel like giving up, but this feels different. Feels like learning." So he made small changes. He propped his legs up when reading, he cut back on salty snacks and started reading the sodium content on labels. Marion began cooking with more herbs, thyme, garlic, basil, to replace the salt. She swapped canned soups for homemade broth and started using lemon zest instead of seasoning powder. Louis didn't love it all at first, but he understood the reason now. The swelling wasn't just in his feet, it was a sign that his body was holding on to what it couldn't release. What touched him most, though, was how Marion adjusted with him. Not for him, but with him. She sat beside him in the evenings, both their legs up, reading books in silence. When they cooked, they did it together, laughing as they adjusted recipes. He started to feel lighter, not just in body but in spirit. And that's when Louis began to see his swelling not just as a symptom, but as a signal. A message from his body that balance had shifted and that he could choose even now to begin restoring it. Not perfectly, not urgently, but lovingly. He started choosing loose shoes, taking slower walks, drinking water with slices of cucumber, no lectures, no rules, just attention. And with that attention came trust, in his body, in Marion, and in this quieter, slower way of healing. It happened on a mild spring afternoon, the kind where the wind feels like a soft hand brushing the trees and the sky forgets what clouds look like. Louis had decided to take a short walk around the block, something he used to do every day without thinking. Buddy trotted along at his usual pace, sniffing bushes and wagging his tail, unaware that Louis was already falling behind. At first, it was just a deeper breath, then another and another. By the time he reached the corner near the Hendersons' house, he had to stop. He leaned against a lamppost, his hand gripping the cool metal. His chest felt tight, not like pain, not sharp, but like someone had quietly turned down the oxygen in the world. The air was there, but it wasn't enough. His heart beat faster. He looked around, hoping no one would see him. He didn't want to be that old man who couldn't finish a walk. When he got back home, Louis didn't say anything. He didn't want to worry Marion. But that night, while brushing his teeth, he paused in the mirror. His face looked pale, not just tired, but colorless. He'd been cold all day too, even with the window shut. And it hit him. This wasn't just tiredness. This was something else. Something deeper. The next morning, he finally told Marion. "I couldn't catch my breath yesterday," he said quietly, pouring his coffee. "Had to stop halfway down the block." Marion's face fell, but she nodded. "Let's go back in," she said. "Something's not right." At the clinic, after a few tests and a long, thoughtful silence, the doctor explained gently, "Louis, this is tied to your kidneys again. When they start to decline, two things happen. You hold on to fluid, which can press on your lungs, and your body stops making enough red blood cells. Less oxygen gets around. That breathlessness, the cold, the pale skin, it's all connected." Louis listened, his eyes focused on a spot on the floor. It wasn't that he didn't understand, he did. He just didn't expect it to feel this invisible, to look fine to everyone else, but feel like he was carrying around invisible weights. That night, he sat in the living room long after the news had ended, staring at the dark screen. Marion sat beside him without a word. Then finally he spoke. "I thought I was getting old, just tired, slower, but now it feels like my body's quietly falling behind." Marion reached for his hand, and for a moment they just sat there, the silence between them filled with everything words couldn't say. Then she said, "You're not falling behind. You're adjusting. That's strength too." It was a turning point, not because things got easier, but because Louis started to acknowledge the changes, not fight them, not hide them. He started resting more intentionally, not just collapsing from exhaustion. He used extra pillows to sleep upright on days he felt pressure in his chest. He drank warm teas that soothed him, and he began tracking his breath, not obsessively, just curiously. "How am I today?" he'd ask himself instead of, "What's wrong now?" He also started doing something new, writing. Not long essays or journals, just a few lines each evening about how he felt, what he noticed, what made him smile. "Breathed easier after that ginger tea," one note read. Another, "Felt short of breath after lunch, maybe too salty." It became a way of understanding, of listening more closely. And in those quiet pages, Louis discovered something profound. Breath wasn't just about lungs or red blood cells, it was about space, making room to feel, to slow down, to be. And in giving himself that space, with every slower walk, every moment of rest, he began to feel not broken, but human, still living, still learning, still breathing. It was the remote control that finally made Louis say something. He'd been searching for it all morning, lifting couch cushions, checking kitchen drawers, even looking under the rug. It turned up in the fridge, right next to the carton of milk. Marion laughed at first, thinking it was a harmless old age mix-up, but Louis didn't laugh with her. He stood there staring at the fridge and said in a quiet voice, "That's not the first time this week." She turned to look at him. He wasn't embarrassed. He was afraid. Louis had always prided himself on being sharp. He could tell you which wrench to use by the sound of a bolt turning. He remembered phone numbers, birthdays, every oil change he'd ever done on his old Dodge. But lately, things felt foggy. Not like forgetting, more like walking into a room and not knowing why he was there. Losing the thread of a conversation halfway through. Reading the same page twice and realizing it still didn't sink in. "It's like my brain is tired," he told the doctor during his next visit. "Like it's working through soup." The doctor nodded again, gentle as ever. "Louis, that's real. When your kidneys can't filter waste properly, that waste stays in your blood and eventually reaches your brain. It affects how clearly you think, how well you remember. We call it brain fog, and it's more common than people realize." Louis didn't want to believe it at first. It sounded too soft, too vague, but it was there in the way he lost track of time, forgot where he put his keys, or struggled to focus on the crossword puzzle he used to breeze through every morning. One night, he couldn't remember what movie they'd watched just 2 days before. Marion gently reminded him, and he nodded, pretending it came back to him. It hadn't. But here's what made the difference. Marion never made him feel small. She didn't joke about it or treat him like a child. She simply adapted, wrote notes on the fridge, labeled containers in the pantry, reminded him kindly when things slipped. "We're in this together," she'd say with a smile, and that grounded him more than anything else. Louis began doing little exercises, not the kind you'd find in books, but personal rituals. Naming 3 things he was grateful for before bed, reciting their son's birthday and address out loud during breakfast, reading aloud instead of silently. He kept his mind moving, not to fix it, but to connect with it, to keep the lights on, so to speak. He also began to understand something deeper. That memory wasn't just about sharpness, it was about presence. And when the fog came, he didn't fight it so hard. He sat with it. He let it pass like a cloud. Some days were clearer than others. Some felt slow and frustrating. But he was still there. He still knew who he was. And more importantly, he was learning to forgive the parts of himself that were changing. Marion started reading with him again. Books from their younger days. He'd stop her sometimes and ask, "Can you read that part again?" Not because he didn't understand, but because it felt good to hear it twice. Familiar words, familiar voice, something to hold on to. And that's how Lewis began to shift, from fear to gentleness, from confusion to curiosity. He stopped expecting his mind to perform like it used to, and instead treated it with care, like a tired but loyal friend. Because in the end, it wasn't about remembering every detail, it was about staying connected to Marion, to his story, to the moment he was in. And in those moments, even the fog couldn't take away who he truly was. The rain had just stopped when Louis stepped out onto the porch. The world smelled clean, like damp earth and new beginnings. He sat down slowly in his chair, Buddy curling beside him, and looked out across the yard. The maple tree dripped gently, the wind was soft. It had been nearly 4 months since that first doctor's visit. Since the fatigue, the swelling, the breathlessness, since the realization that something inside him had been asking for attention long before he knew how to hear it. He sipped his tea, warm with a slice of ginger, and thought about how far he'd come. Not in dramatic leaps, not in cures or breakthroughs, but in awareness, in the way he noticed his body now, the way he paused when his heart felt heavy, the way he adjusted what was on his plate, not with resentment, but with quiet care. He still had days when he felt foggy, still woke some mornings with swollen ankles or a strange taste in his mouth. But now, those days didn't scare him. They simply reminded him to slow down. One afternoon, their son came to visit. He watched his father move a little more carefully, speak a little more slowly, and asked, "How are you really doing, Dad?" Louis thought for a long moment before answering. "I'm learning how to listen," he said, "to things I used to ignore." It wasn't just about the kidneys anymore. It was about trust between mind and body, between husband and wife, between the silence and what it might be trying to say. For years, Louis had powered through discomfort. He was raised to be tough, to keep going. But now, in this chapter of life, he was discovering a different kind of strength, one rooted in softness, in presence, in choice. He started keeping a small notebook by his chair, a place to jot down not just his symptoms, but his observations. Slept better after walking in the morning. Felt lightheaded after eating canned soup. Easier to breathe after afternoon nap. It wasn't science, it was story. And through that story, he learned patterns, he learned grace. Marion noticed the change in him too, not just physically, but emotionally. He smiled more, even on tired days. He let her help him without protest. They spent more time sitting together, not always talking, just being. That was new. That was peace. The doctor at the next check-in remarked on his stability. "You've kept your numbers from slipping. That's something to be proud of." Louis nodded. "It's not just the meds," he said. "It's the little things. The way I eat, the way I rest, the way I think." The truth is, Louis would probably live with chronic kidney issues for the rest of his life. But that didn't mean he had no power. He had made his body a partner, not a burden. And in doing so, he'd found a new rhythm. Slower, quieter, but just as full of life. As the evening settled in and the porch light flickered on, Louis leaned back and exhaled. He didn't feel sick. He didn't feel broken. He felt aware. And that awareness, that quiet choice to pay attention, that was his healing. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for our health isn't to fight harder. It's to listen more gently, to treat our bodies not as machines to be fixed, but as stories to be heard. And in hearing them, really hearing them, we give ourselves the gift of presence, of peace, of time. If you've made it this far, maybe something Louis felt feels familiar. Maybe you've been more tired than usual. Maybe you've noticed swelling, changes in your breath, or just a quiet sense that something's off. Maybe the people around you say, "It's just age," and part of you wants to believe them, but another part of you isn't so sure. That part deserves to be heard. Because the truth is, kidney problems rarely arrive with sirens. They come quietly. They settle into your days like fog on a window, barely there until suddenly you can't see clearly anymore. That's what Louis learned, and that's what I want you to remember. When your body speaks in whispers, you must learn to listen in stillness. Louis didn't turn his life around with grand gestures. He didn't need to. What changed everything was his willingness to pause, to ask, "Why am I so tired?" instead of brushing it off, to say, "Something isn't right," even when he didn't have all the answers. That moment, the one where he chose to care, was the moment his healing began. And now, I want to say something to you as a doctor who's seen hundreds of patients walk this path. You are not too late. You are not too old. You are not being dramatic. You are paying attention, and that might just be the thing that saves you. So take the walk, but slower. Drink the water, not because someone told you to, but because your body needs it. Look at your urine, your skin, your breath, your thoughts, not with fear, but with curiosity. Let your body tell you what it's been trying to say. And when it does, be kind, be patient, be like Louis. Because listening isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And wisdom is how we stay alive. Not just in years, but in presence, in peace, in the quiet joy of knowing we didn't ignore the signs. In the beginning, Louis didn't know what was happening, only that rest no longer felt restful and the foods he once loved had lost their comfort. At first, he blamed it on age, on the weather, on anything but his own body quietly asking for help. But over time, something in him shifted. He stopped brushing it off. He started listening. Through swelling ankles, forgotten words, and breath that wouldn't come, Louis found a new way of living. Not rushed, not panicked, but attentive. He didn't need to change everything overnight. He simply chose to notice, to care a little more about what went on inside, and to honor the signs that once felt too small to matter. And maybe that's the lesson worth holding on to. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to pay attention to your body, to your energy, to the little shifts in how you feel day to day. Because the earlier you listen, the more options you'll have. And the more you understand yourself, the less fear there is when things begin to change. If something about Louis's story reminded you of your own, don't wait. Be curious. Ask questions. Take gentle steps forward. Because kidney disease doesn't always come loudly, but your care, your awareness, your choices, they can be powerful. And remember, it's never too late to hear what your body has been trying to say. Even the quietest signs deserve your attention. And healing often begins with a whisper,